Hello, Dr. Peterson. This is an idea I've been wrestling with for quite some time now. This idea of a lot of the greatest sources of wisdom that we've received throughout human history, either through text, experiences, or scriptures, seems to always come from people going into isolation and then coming back. So I've had a hard time trying to figure out from a scientific point of view or evolutionary point of view, what would compel an organism that is centered around its behavior is centered around surviving especially for humans in social groups as well as reproducing, to want to go into isolation, and then not only that, but obtain some level of information that actually helps the group in coming back.
That's a really good question. Okay, so there's this neuropsychologist named L. Conan Goldberg. And Goldberg was a student of Alexander Luria. And Alexander Luria was a Russian neuropsychologist, perhaps the foremost neuropsychologist of the mid to late 20th century. And he had students, Sokolov and Vinogradova, who discovered the orienting reflex, for example. The orienting reflex is the reflex that orients you when something anomalous interferes with your goal-directed behavior. It was a major discovery, like one of the 4 or 5 most important discoveries that have ever been made in psychology, I would say, certainly in neuroscience. So Luria was a big deal. And he was the first person who really established the functional role of the prefrontal cortex as well. So, and he had a very nice overall view of how the brain functioned. His book was written in 1980, and there's still lots in it that's really useful, which is pretty strange for a science that's advanced that quickly. Anyways, so Goldberg came from a great pedigree. I believe Luria's teacher was Pavlov, if I remember correctly. So anyways, Goldberg, you hear, some of you may have heard the idea that the left hemisphere is more linguistic than the right hemisphere, as the left hemisphere is specialized for language and the right hemisphere is specialized for nonverbal imagistic communication. The left hemisphere has a pretty well-organized microstructure, and the right hemisphere is more diffuse as well. And that's true in left-handed males in particular. So the circuitry can be switched around a bit, but it's okay. The modules are basically the same, although they can be moved a little bit. But Goldberg thought that it isn't language versus non-language, it's routine versus novelty. And so the left hemisphere, and there's a neuropsychologist, physician named Ramachandran who's done some very interesting work that's pertinent to this. Maybe I'll tell you a story about him. Anyways, Goldberg believed that the right hemisphere, so you have very old systems underneath both cortical hemispheres that do things like respond to anomaly, to the thing that doesn't fit, to the predator in the distance. Some of that's extraordinarily fast, so that would be like a snake reflex that can move you away from a snake in less time than it takes the snake to bite. And it's really a reflex, it doesn't even hit your brain, it's really super fast. And then there's a defensive crouch that's instantiated higher up in the nervous system, but that's still remarkably fast. And then there's fear as an emotion and the orientation of attention. And then there's the cognitive processing, and that all streams out across a time span, right? And maybe that time span is half a second. So, and that's really a long time if something is attacking you. So you got those initial responses are quite primitive, but they're extraordinarily fast. All right, so there's subcortical structures that orient you towards novelty and prepare you for freezing or for attending. And the right hemisphere seems to be dominated by those systems. So imagine that what happens is that something threatens you, you orient towards it, the right hemisphere produces a bunch of images about what it might be. So imagine that's what happens when a child is afraid of the dark. The child's on the bed, they're afraid of the dark, they're crouched because they're frozen like a prey animal, and their right hemisphere is producing monsters to inhabit the darkness that are the child's hypotheses about what might be out there. Okay. Because that's what you want to know, right? You want to know what's out there. And then you want to know what to do about it. I can tell you 2 kids' dreams that are sort of relevant to that. So when my daughter was about 3, she came into the bedroom that my wife and I had, and she was crying. She'd had a nightmare. And she said that she saw a stream, and there was garbage all over the stream. And she didn't like that. And so I sat her down. I said, okay, so imagine the stream with the garbage in it. Now imagine that you're taking the garbage out and throwing it in a garbage bin. And so I got her to like visualize that, because that kind of puts her back in the semi-dream state. And then she cleaned up the mess, and then she could go off to sleep. Now you could tell the child, don't worry about it, the dream isn't real. But that's true, because it's not real like other daytime things are, but it's not like it's not real. It's a dream. Like a dream is real, it's just not the same kind of real. And so what I did with her was to indicate to her practically that if she saw something anomalous, something that was out of place, right, something that was a mess, that it was within her capacity to set it right. Okay, so now your right hemisphere tells you what monsters might inhabit the darkness. Now what you have to do is figure out, there's 2 things you have to figure out. One is what to do about a given monster. And the other is to figure out what to do about the class of all possible monsters. Right. That's a whole different thing. That's something that only human beings are capable of, that level of abstraction. Right. And so what you might do about a particular monster is hide or go out and get rid of it, if it was just an actual animal, right? But that doesn't help, because there's all the other potential predators that are still there. And so maybe you can go hunt all them down, but that doesn't help either, because you can't hunt them all down. It's not very likely anyways. So instead, what you have to do is figure out how to configure yourself so that you're in the best possible position to fight off the monsters when they come. That's your best bet. All right, so now people are trying to figure this out forever. They're trying to figure out what's the answer to the problem of the class of all possible monsters. Part of that's sacrifice. So there are routines, for example, in Hinduism, with the goddess Kali. You make offerings to Kali, who's this devouring goddess, and then she turns into her benevolent counterpart. And so sacrifice is actually one way that you can tame the monsters. If you think about the monster as the set of all negative future potentialities, you make the proper sacrifices, those monsters stay at bay. But then there's heroism as an alternative too, which means the active confrontation of the class of all possible monsters and the building of yourself up into the sort of courageous person that can do that. It took a tremendous amount of meditation to transform those images, say, of the monsters or to solve the problem of the class of those monsters. So now I'll tell you another child's dream. So some of you have probably heard this before, but it's such a great dream that it's worth telling. So I was at my sister-in-law's house once, and her son was running around. He's about 4, very precocious, very verbal, very intelligent, running around with a night hat on and a sword. So he's engaged in this pretty intense play world. And when he goes to sleep, he puts the night hat on his pillow and the sword by his pillow. And at the same time, he's having night terrors. So he's waking up, and it had been for a number of weeks, waking up screaming, but he doesn't know why. There's some things that aren't going so well in the household, and the parents get divorced shortly afterwards. Okay, so that's what's going on underneath, right? And he's also going to go to kindergarten, and so he's about to go into the world. And so he's coping with this, you know. So I'm watching him zoom around as this night and thinking that's pretty cool. And that night he woke up and was screaming. And so we were all at breakfast the next morning. And I said, "Did you dream anything?" And he got really intense. And he said, "Yes, I had a dream." And I said, "Well, what was the dream?" And he said, "Well, I was out on this field, and all these like dwarfs came up to me. They were only about as high as my knees, and they didn't have any arms. They had powerful legs, and They were covered with like hairy feathers and grease, and there was cross carved in the top of their head, and they had beaks. And whenever he moved anywhere, they would jump at him with their beaks, and there were lots of them. And everyone like just said nothing at breakfast. It was like, and he was right into this story, eh? And so we were all like, yeah, well, that accounts for all the screaming. And and then he said, yeah, and then in the background there was a dragon. And every time the dragon puffed out smoke, it would turn into these dwarves. It's like, oh man, kid, you really got a problem there. You got beaked things that are biting you, and you can kill them, and that's fine. But then there's the dragon just puffing out new ones. So it's like a hydra problem, right? The old hydra is the serpent. You cut off one head, 7 more grow. It's not a good thing. And it's such a cool dream because it really portrayed this class of all possible monsters problem. So you've got the specific monsters, and that's a problem. So you've got to get rid of them. But that's not the problem. The problem is that there's something in the background that's just generating monsters like mad. And so I said to him, what do you think you could do about that? And that's a loaded question, right? That's like leading the witness in a trial. You don't get to ask a question like that because it implies the answer. What could you do about that is not any different than saying you could do something about that, right? So I hinted at that as a possibility, and his eyes lit up. Now you remember, he's already running around as a knight, eh? So he kind of already knew what to do because he had the whole sword and the hat, and with that you know that you can go after the dragon. He kind of got that. And he said, I'd get my dad, and then I'd jump up on top of the dragon, and I'd poke out both of its eyes with my sword, and then I'd go right down its throat to the firebox where the fire comes out, and I'd carve out a piece of the firebox, and then I'd use that as a shield. And I thought, yes! Right. Man, it's so smart, eh? Because he got the thing instantly. He knew. So imagine, first of all, he thought, okay, I have to go to the heart of the problem, right? And really to the heart, not to the dragon, but right down the damn thing's gullet, right to the place where the fire was actually being created. Because it was there you could find the shield, and that he'd take this thing that was fireproof and make a shield out of it. And so that was just dead, bloody perfect. It was so cool. And you think, well, how could a kid come up with that? And there's a bunch of answers. I mean, one is, we know snake fear is innate. We know that now. There's been recent research that has demonstrated that. Okay, so, and we've been preyed on and been predators for a very long period of time. So the idea that, and I found something else interesting about the brain out about the brain recently too, in a book I was reading by Ray Kurzweil called How to Build a Mind. I think that's what it was called. It was quite a good book. So I think it was in that book, or it was in a neuroscience paper I was reading. Doesn't matter, but it was in one of those two places. So you know that scanning technology has got more and more high resolution over the last few years, right? It just gets more and more high resolution all the time. And so people are now able to look at the microstructures of the brain in a way that hasn't been possible before. And so the old idea with the cortex basically was that the cortex was full of a bunch of neurons, and then when one neuron and another fired at the same time, they would wire together. And that's kind of how your brain learned to make connections. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that will do. And then it was found that it wasn't quite that simple, because what your cortex is made out of are these columns of neurons that are duplicated, sort of like a centipede's legs. You know, it's very simple genetic code to add another set of legs to a centipede. It's sort of like that with your brain. It's made out of all these columns, and the columns are basically already quite wired up. And then as you learn, the columns wire together. Okay, so there's some pre-existent structure there, but there's more pre-existent structure than that was thought. So it's basically that there are already tracts that link columns together that are in different parts of the brain, and the columns themselves can send out dendrites to these superhighways, which are already there, and then the superhighway is there, and then it can generate connections to the columns at the end of the superhighway. So what that means is that there's a tremendous amount of cortical structure already in place, but there's plasticity around that. And when I read that, I thought, well, that's part of the source of the archetypes. There's already an archetypal structure there, that as well as the subcortical structures. So you could say that, like, the kid already had within him not only the capacity to represent not only the monster, but the class of all possible monsters. And the fact that the problem wasn't monsters, the problem was that monsters could continually be generated, which is a way worse problem. And then the answer to that isn't to kill an individual monster. The answer to that is go to the source of the monstrous itself and defeat it. So it's absolutely staggering, and you could imagine that it would take a tremendous amount of meditative effort for people to have come up with that solution over a very long period of time. So now, the point of the representation is to formulate a picture of what it is that's the threat, so that you can then formulate a general all-purpose solution. And so there's this image of Kali, which I really like, because Kali is sort of the goddess of the darkness, let's say, and destruction. And so Kali is, she has a headdress of fire. Her hair is on fire, and she has a headdress of skulls, and she has hands cut off all around her neck, and she has a belt that's often snakes, but she's sometimes eating the intestines of this guy that she's just given birth to and that she's sitting on. And she has 8 legs like a spider, and she's in a web of fire. And so she's a monster in some sense that represents everything that might terrify and devour you. And the question is, so you come up with that representation as an image to represent the class of all terrifying things, and then you have to generate a solution in the face of that class, and sacrifice is one of the solutions. But that heroic encounter is another one of the solutions, and that's the one that he catalyzed. Now, he'd read lots of books, he'd watched lots of Disney movies, you know, and he'd seen the heroic pattern portrayed many, many places, and his little brain was working like mad to extract out the essence of that and to embody it. And when I asked him that question, it just went snap, and all those things lined up, and his night terrors went away. That was it. And I followed up with his mom, because it was really quite remarkable, the whole set of occurrences. You know, and he didn't have night terrors that night, even though he'd been having them nightly, and that was the end of them. Because he'd solved his problem. Like, he needed to be the courageous knight that went after the dragon. And so that is what people need to be. So I think when we go into solitude, we shut off the external stimulation, and we let the dreaming part of our mind emerge. And that's this nonverbal pattern detector that thinks in images. And it's the thing that mediates between what we don't understand and what we do understand. Like, if you understand it completely, you can say it and you can act it out. If you don't understand it, you represent it in images. And it's the emotion, fear, withdrawal, paralysis, and then that manifests itself in an image of what that might be. And that image is the basis for the story, and it's the basis for further development of the idea. And to go into isolation is to let those images emerge and to dream a little bit. And then that moves you ahead into the future.
So to use your language that you used before, it's not enough just to map out the danger that is imminent in front of you, but all the potential dangers that you could come up with in abstract form.
Yeah, well, remember what happens when God throws Adam and Eve out of paradise. They become aware that they're going to die, right? The future becomes a problem. Because you could say the future is the place of all potential monsters, right? And so just the monster that you have right in front of you, it's like, yeah, well, you get rid of that, but that doesn't solve your problem, does it? The problem is, how do you exist in a world full of monsters? And part of that answer is, well, you become a monster yourself. That's a big part of the answer. But it's an incomplete answer, because if you're just a monster, then you're just as bad as the monsters. So you have to be a monstrous enough to contend with the monsters, but then you have to be civilized enough so that you're not a monster yourself. And that's more or less equivalent to the Jungian integration of the shadow. So, yep.
The Tourist. Fiction, based on a true visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau death camps. Auschwitz, Poland, February 2019. Buying the book. You buy the book Viktor E. Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It was 45 zlotys. You realize this is less than $9. The woman gives you the book and a bottle of water as a bonus. The book was recommended to you more than once. Once in a co-creation meeting and another at a recommendation through a family friend. Then, Dr. Jordan Peterson mentioned it a few times. Now is the time to read it. Now, at the very grounds where Viktor E. Frankl stayed as a dead man walking. You are better at listening to the consciousness that tells you to act and not act. That voice is becoming more clear, especially now that you're sober. It's as if Jiminy Cricket is back and you have an opportunity to become a real person and not just some puppet on strings with your face looking more ridiculous every time you lie. The truth will indeed set you free, one step at a time, starting with the discipline of paying attention to that Jiminy Cricket voice and following through with its command. Buy the book. If you didn't know any better, you think that you were in a tour about the American colonies based on the brick buildings and the way it was aligned together. The double-layered 400-volt barbed wires were a clue in that this was utopia gone awry. 6 million Poles, Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, prisoners of war, traitors who helped the Jews, defected soldiers from duty were sent here. This wasn't the first death camp, but it was the most effective one at killing. You realize while walking through the brown bricks of each block that there is an energy that carries through. Spirits want you to write down what they have discovered now that they have a bird's eye, hindsight, 2020 view of what had happened. Block 4, Zaglada, or the extermination block, is where you all first start. The number 4 in Chinese is the number of death. Some tourists around you are coughing. The cough and flu virus has been going around, but you are immune because you started building up the antivirus when you were in bed with the flu the last 2 weeks you were in Berlin. You remember Aaron called you the first time in a month while you were at the emergency room when you were infected with the virus. At the emergency room, the Germans drew your blood to check your flu. That was suspect. You think the Germans are drawing your blood so they can take your DNA for EU Agenda 21 processing. While inside Block 4, you open up the book again and read page 9 of the preface, written by Harold S. Kushner. We have come to recognize that this is a profoundly religious book. It insists that life is meaningful and that we must learn to see life as meaningful despite our circumstances. As you enter the place, it is eerily quiet. You all have headphones, so you hear the voice of the tour guide who works for the museum, separate from the girl tour guide whose job apparently was to just tell you the rules of the camp while transporting you there. He spoke through his Bluetooth walkie-talkie device that connected you to him, along with the 28 headphones connecting with him for the 28 tourists in your group. Your group were among a dozen other groups from different travel companies that bus people in from different areas in Poland. Even though you stayed in Warsaw for the month, you paid 13 euros to bus from Warsaw to Krakow and found a place through Airbnb in the heart of Market Square in Krakow for 3 days so you could write, fight, and recover. The tour guide described how they were killed. There were 5 to 10 people brought together, confined within a square meter, with hooks on the ceiling to hang their clothes and shower heads installed to give the veneer that they would be just rinsing off. The tour guide made note that the Nazis installed the shower heads so that the mass would not panic or rebel. Only the capos knew what was going on. The capos were also prisoners, but who were appointed to bark orders at their own people and do the dirty work of cremating their fellow inmates while keeping their complicit silence. Only capos were given alcohol so they could continue lying to themselves that they were somehow going to be the exception. They started with pesticides, specifically Zyklone B, which proved the most effective at suffocating and melting away any evidence of their existence. Then, they were immediately sent off for cremation. It was the capos, prisoners who acted as trustees, who did the dirty work, moving dead bodies from the showers to the crematory. They drank alcohol to forget that one day they will be demoted and be among those cremated. While your group were looking at prison documents behind encased glass and portraits of the photos taken there, you were also holding the thin, tiny pocketbook on your left hand. You started reading whilst the tour guide was talking. The tourists were walking, and you had your wall up. KISNOU wrote, quote, "His experience in Auschwitz, terrible as it was, reinforced what was already one of his key ideas. Life is not primarily a quest for pleasure, as Freud believed, or a quest for power, as Alfred Adler taught, but a quest for meaning. The great task for any person is to find meaning in his or her life. Frankl saw 3 possible sources for meaning: in work, doing something significant; in love, caring for another person, as Frankl held on to the image of his wife through the darkest days in Auschwitz; and in courage in difficult times." Block 11. In Block 11, there were portraits lined up against the walls of all the people who passed through this very building you are now also passing through. Each room felt like a horror exhibition show. One room is where people starved. Another room is where people spilled their guts out from typhus and dysentery, and another room was clean and pristine. You stopped at this room that belonged to the SS. Instinctively, you knew that this was the biggest torture room. This is the room where people thought they were doing the world a service, where people thought they were the heroes, not realizing that they were becoming the monsters and the very evil they sought to eradicate. Day in and day out, they clock in, they clock out. Some for months, some for years, to this hellhole they have concocted in an ideology, a life lie of the master race, ridding the world of the source of all evil by killing off the evils of other people's evil first, completely blind to the truth that evil clocks in and clocks out in a uniform with fat fingers and fat tummies, numb, dumb, blinded to their own character defects. While the prisoners got skinnier, their energy weakening, their skulls defining and rib cages protruding, their cries more desperate, the perpetrators were having to witness this slow wasting away as a projection of their own consciousness, like a picture of Dorian Gray. As a Nazi warden, you can look into the block you are in charge of and see the sallow, pathetic, desperate portrait of your own soul by the way you have treated your neighbor. This is the spiritual law of life and death is in the power of the tongue. And though physically they are plump and healthy, Spiritually, their souls are the exact figure of those they had projected their hate towards. While they had kept them wallowing in their own feces, undernourished, made into functional numbers for war purposes, work or die, the Nazi manifested their hatred towards them in the guise of racial superiority. This life lie later festered into full-blown narcissism when they acted out the life lie that they were acting on God's directive to cleanse the human race. And in the spell of narcissism, one is capable of doing all kinds of evil acts in the name of good. Exploiting the corpses. The German people who followed Hitler were under a hypnotic spell, a powerful one, and a spell is basically acting out a life lie. The life lie they lived out is that the Jews were the root cause of all the world's problems. This is one of the tricks of the devil, the magic trick of projection. A projection is when one is experiencing toxic evil within the heart, but hides it in shame and guilt, but recognizes it in the other. So instead of grappling with the evil within one's own heart, one will call it out on the other, judge them, punish the other in hopes that the one who is perpetuating the judgment will be somehow secretly redeemed. Only after the other is fixed. This is the left-hand path, to play many gods by exacting judgment and punishment for what one arbitrates as good and bad. King Sisyphus was punished for his trickery by moving a stone up an endless steep hill. This is a metaphor of those who carry the judgment and carry the burden of playing gods. This is the road of insanity, to becoming your own gods, knowing, judging good and evil. The rock is the same rock that people used to throw at Mary Magdalene before Jesus intervened and asked those who have hands raised with their stone ready to throw. Whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. And it had to be within the confines of a Jewish community because that is the community who received God's commandments first. Judge and be judged. Forgive and you will be forgiven. But you now believe that the perpetrator has it worse in the grand scheme of the character role it plays. For even though the perpetrator has temporary comfort, food, water, shelter, they have to carry all the rocks of judgment. You saw a room that says exploiting the corpses. Whose corpses were really exploited in this scenario? The death wall prayer. Upon leaving Block 11, you go to the courtyard where it was routine to line up prisoners and shoot them execution style. There were flowers behind the bullet-ridden black wooden planks that scale the bricks. One bouquet of roses were red, white, and blue, a gift from the United States. You head there, bow your head, and you pray. Thank you for being God's chosen first, to act out the role that few of us wanted to take, so we can see for generations to come the exact nature of evil. Because we have seen it play out, we now know what evil is. Evil is the better than, the one up, the in order for me to live, you must die, the in order for me to be okay in my skin, you must get out of yours, the zero-sum game. Thank you for being the first to carry God's word and to reveal through the roles you have played the greatest test the world needed to witness, that this is what happens when one chooses to create their own meanings, their own realities, their own moral righteousness. Through the roles you have played, you help the world see the nature of evil. Because of what you have experienced, the world is beginning to wake up to the insanity of this world of projections. Thank you for acting out the hardest roles on the world stage. Tears well up, and you allow them to surge through your tear ducts down your cheeks. You realize that somewhere in another higher dimension, in another playing field of reality, we had all chosen our roles before incarnating here. That is why you are crying in front of the black wooden planks where bullet holes riddle with reminders of what would happen if you acted out the left-hand playbook to its abyss. The new covenant of God's love made manifest through the walk of Jesus Christ makes one thing clear. God loves us more than we love us. From this vantage point, you can see the tragedy in all this. You can see that both the perpetrator and the victim suffered, and even though the victims suffered more in the flesh, it was the perpetrators who suffered more in the spirit. They had to witness themselves act out evil. They locked up their consciousness like they locked up 5 men to a room and squeezed, hoping to suffocate their consciousness like they were hoping to suffocate any witnesses of their own evil. The mass killing machine is the product of the left-hand path gone unchecked. Self will run riot. The Nazis played God. The magic finger. Viktor Frankl, page 25. He, the officer, had assumed an attitude of careless ease. None of us had the slightest idea of the sinister meaning behind that little movement of a man's finger, pointing now to the right and now to the left, but far more frequently to the left. The significance of that finger was explained to us that evening. It was the first selection, the first verdict, made on our existence and non-existence. For the great majority of our transport, about 90%, it meant death. Their sentence was carried out within the next few hours. You can only stay at the death camp for a few short hours. The thought of coming here day in and day out is the hell that bears the greatest burden. At Block 11, they showed you the details of the living conditions. Yes, 1,200 were packed into a brick building with a room capacity of 200, and they could barely lay down, but their time there is short, soon to be transported to a different dimension, back home. But the room where the SS stayed, that is the most torturous room the devil machinated for the few who played death in this horror show, for they played both the monster and the fool. They played the character of the fool because they thought they were playing the hero roles when they were actually playing the monsters. Everybody else in that building knew they were working for the devil. Both angels and fallen angels knew they were working for the devil. But the few that clocked in and out wearing uniforms that said Protection Squadron thought they were the saviors. The joke is really on the punchline. The Nazis were indeed already punched. The lessons the Holy Ghosts told you to write down. Hurt people hurt people. You can't use the same method to solve the problem with the same method that created it. You can't become evil while fighting evil. It's not the technology or the advancement of it, because what is technology but an amplification of its intent? A knife that can cut to cook food can also be used to kill. A nuclear power plant could light up an entire city, and it can also be used to destroy an entire city. Even if the Jewish conspiracy were true about annihilating the entire German people revealed in Mein Kampf, Hitler's My Struggle, It really doesn't matter, does it, when you become the very evil you proclaim that you are fighting? Nazi, the word Nazi, used to be a label, a name, worn with pride, and the word represented perfection, orderly precision, superior knowledge, evolution, closest to utopia, closest to how God designed us to become. So you made all your means justify the ends. If the means of becoming perfect means having to become evil first in order to be perfect, then what's the point of being perfect if in the end it will mean being perfectly evil? The algorithm of being your own gods and creating your own reality in this moral relativity does not work. The events acted out and played out here is empirical evidence that it does not work. Now, the word Nazi means the fool, the evil fool. Through the Nazis' eyes. When you learned about the Holocaust in high school, you had learned it through the eyes of the victim. Now that you are here, ground zero, at the site of the killings, you are perceiving it through the eyes of the killers. You recall Dr. Jordan Peterson's take on reading history through the eyes of the perpetrator, and you put yourself in the shoes of someone capable of pushing the button, telling someone to go inside the death chamber, knowing they are about to become poisoned, as someone capable of yelling at them, beating them, treating them as if they were pests, vermin, evil-producing maggots. You would have to then put the decent part of your consciousness away, compartmentalize it, lock it somewhere tight in a small container, barely breathing, so you could dissociate yourself from the reality that you're killing babies, women, children that were once, or could be potentially, your neighbors, dentists, doctors, professors, musicians, counselors, teachers, lovers, and that you play a key role in sending them to their premature deaths. It would take massive dissociation, and that dissociation is then projected into reality when you would come up with the cruel idea of packing together men like sardines into tight cells with only a hole to ventilate through, because that would be a reflection of your subconscious when you have packed all the decent parts of you into a tight cell in hopes of killing it. Delighting in evil. This is why you can't be a toxic feminine criticizing and judging other women who exhibit toxic femininity, because you are that of the same quality you judge. You are the Jezebel. You are the perpetrator. You are the toxic feminine. Thereby, once again, locked in the same conundrum that the Nazis had faced during their experiment with the death camps. In the Nazis' eyes, all Jews were scums. It was quite apparent that all they cared about was to save their own hides. I mean, just look at the way the capos acted. Quote, prominent capos, prisoners who acted as trustees, having special privileges, or well-known prisoners. It was these common prisoners who bore no distinguishing marks on their sleeves whom the capos really despised. While these ordinary prisoners had nothing to eat, the capos were never hungry. In fact, many of the capos fared better in the camp than they had in their entire lives. Often they were harder on the prisoners than they were the guards, and beat them more cruelly than the SS men did. If they did not comply with what was expected of them, they were immediately demoted. They soon became much like the SS men and the camp wardens, and may be judged on a similar psychological basis. The Nazis set up the game so that the temptation of selling out is strong. This positive feedback loop reinforced the Nazi view that all Jews are evil and capable of selling out their own kind for a temporary relief. In the Nazis' eyes, they could plainly see evil, but not realize that they have set up a trap for evil to ripen, and the act of setting up this trap is evil in and of itself. Sociopathy is a way to cope with the evil that has taken control of you. You are now a puppet for the dark side to use and abuse. The lust for power, the lust for control, the lust for blood. Seeing others suffer, whimper at your feet, begging you, being nice to you because you held their life and death fate at the movement of a finger. The enjoyment for exacting pain in the other to give you the temporary hit of power, like a hit from a meth pipe, is the devil's spell, and you and your Nazi friends were all spellbound. You were also both sexually frustrated and sexually heightened by this cruelty you exact upon the weak. The smell of death, the irritation of feeling trapped in this role that you don't want to even play, but you play to stay alive. You play because all your friends are playing, and you play because you're either part of the power or you're part of the ones that are exterminated. And all that angst for choosing to be the perpetrator gets channeled into the demon on your back, riding you like a mule while you whip someone who can't defend himself. And the more you whip, the more your soul morphs into a sociopathic monster. The more you become a monster, the more you believe in the life lie that you are here to exact punishment for good in the name of God. The more you act out this life lie of social utopia through the beatings, torture, killings, the more your soul corrodes like one drinking battery acid. You were the vessel used by the demons to bring health on earth, and you were living in the shit you were creating. You were shitting with your shoulds. You shitted all over the world. You shitted all over yourself. You had to stay in the death camps longer, day in, day out. The smell of death, putrid typhus smells of piss, shit, blood, and despair. Cries of sorrow, wretched whimpers, and then sobs of men broken, children crying. You hate your job. You fucking hate your job. You hate coming back to this hellhole. You hate having to act like you have it all together while you order your soldiers to do this and do that just so more can come and more can be killed. You can't stand the vermin who carries their own vermin people bodies back and forth, stealing from each other. What rats! They will also one day be demoted and thrown in the furnace. Good riddance. As soon as we rid the world of all these vermin, the sooner I can go back to the normal life with my family, with my normal job. I fucking hate this role. I'm tired of it. Most of all, I hate the smell. I hate the smell. It stains my hair. I carry it home. It seeps into my pores. The stench of human death. I want this all to be over. Why can't they just die quicker? Why can't they just disappear so I can go home? Such is the nature of evil. Thus, the witch is just as trapped as the spells it seeks to trap for others. Thus, the wizard is under a stronger hypnotism when hypnotizing others. Thus, one who places the curses towards the other is double cursed by the same curse. And the Nazis were spiritually dying, turning into the very monsters they had feared with blood on their hands, betraying their own humanity by becoming dehumanized in order to dehumanize others. Evil exists to strip man from its meaning, of its emotions, of its significance, by making all the props and its characters act out the absence of love, thereby causing the observer a feeling of emotional absence. Viktor Frankl described this as the blunting effect. It is the second stage of a prisoner at the camps. Page 36. Quote, "At such a moment, it is not the physical pain which hurts the most, and this applies to adults as much as to punished children. It is the mental agony caused by the injustice, the unreasonableness of it all." Gaslit. Perhaps the punnery does not lose its impact. The Nazis did not just gas the prisoners, but they also gaslit them. They told them that if they worked hard, that they can obtain that farm, that new haven, their own land and community. They fooled them, lied and manipulated them, all the way to when they were taking off their clothes inside the so-called showers before the poison seeped in. Gaslighting is evil. The person being gaslit believe that their punishment is deserved when it is not. The truth is that the perpetrator's own character defects and self-loathing gets projected in the punishment and in, quote, the name of God or, quote, the name of some fill-in-the-blank ideology. It is the mask of virtue one wears to justify the punishment. You read this from the Auschwitz camp. Talking is silver and silence is gold. You witness a mixed family, the woman of Asian descent and a man of European descent and their kids, a younger son and an older daughter. They're beautiful. The dad bonds well with the son, but the wife and the husband seem to have some tension. But the family as a unit gave you a wince of pain, of something you had foregone once upon a time ago, a dream. And you wonder if you could be capable of something cruel. If you were transported in time to those days and they happen to be a Jewish family and you happen to be the German SS, would you be capable of playing the role and giving orders for your underlings to first split their family apart and then take them to the gas chambers to be annihilated? The simple answer is yes, very much so. Your id is a sleeping dragon, a parasite waiting for the right environment to come out. If that were the case, you would have delighted in their annihilation, for then their presence would not have to remind you of the family you had forfeited, and their happiness would not have to remind you of the misery you have chosen. We all have this id. It does not make you a monster, rather that you have a monster to contend with, the way we all each have a monster to contend with. There are monsters in this realm, and we all have been affected by this reptilian id, and we, the ego, the heart center, must choose to feed it, fight it, or ask God for help in defending and offending ourselves from it and with it. So far, in your investigative work called Living Life, the conclusion you have made is the last option. You need supernatural aid. That is the right-hand path. Left alone, the dragon is too powerful, too cunning, too baffling. We are easily hypnotized. We can easily deceive ourselves, and we don't know when we are under the spell, when we are under one. And we don't even realize when we are placing the spell, when we are placing it. Some of us have an inkling. Hindsight is 20/20. While most viewed Nazis as evil, what most don't realize is that we as human beings all have an evil to contend with within ourselves. And so we are all capable of becoming Nazis. When you were 13, you went back to your hometown where you learned about the horrors of what the Japanese did to the Chinese. You went through a historical wax museum that showed how the Japanese came to annihilate the Chinese with the same mentality and viciousness and apathy as the Germans. To slaughter, torture, pillage, kill in the name of a utopian ideology and in the name of kill or be killed. They did this in the name of good, when really they were just projecting their inner inadequacies, character defects, and unresolved childhood traumas into another group they deemed lesser than, when it is just pure projection. Projection starts with envy. The evil eye is the envious eye. The Germans envied the Jews for their intellect, rich culture, wealth, and wisdom. The Japanese envied the Chinese for their intellect, rich culture, wealth, and wisdom. Birkenau, Poland, February 2019. By the time you and your tour group arrived at Birkenau, you are energetically drained. The group is silent. The mood is somber. 1,000 people inside a ditch versus a few dozen people with guns. That's how it happened. Had the Nazis known that 50 years later the world would come back to where they liquidated people in judgment, that they would be judged as evil, would they have acted out the life lie that they were also destroying evil? At Birkenau, you did a thought experiment on yourself, tuning out the tour guide's detailed description of what happened here. There were 29 tourists in this group. If suddenly your entire group was transported in a time capsule to this exact location and you were all given avatar suits to play out this scene and you had to pull cards from a deck, 26 of the 29 were to play the prisoners and only 3 were the perpetrators, and you were given the luxury of first choice. What would you choose? Your first instinct is the SS card. The top of the pyramid, of course. But it would take a heaven and hell internal struggle for you to act on the second instinct, which is to do the right thing. The right thing is always simple, but the right thing is always hard. Should you have taken the SS card, you would have been immediately under a spell. Evil is tricky. It is tricky by nature. When one casts a spell, one is not aware that the effects of the spell will come back to them with the effect sevenfolds, like interest in a credit card debt. This is no different than what you are learning about recovery at the Drinker's Den. This is also hinted at you when you imprinted at the AT&T Center in San Francisco when you came upon Dada. Dada is defense against the dark arts in the world of Harry Potter and Fantastic Beasts. This is what the Love Story Project is about. Defense against this cunning, baffling, and powerful trick called evil, whose mission is to strip the human soul from anything resembling love defined. How do you break a powerful spell? You ask God. The God defined in 1 Corinthians 13. The God revealed in Jesus' walk on earth when you study the love story of Jesus Christ. The fiction based on a true love story of Jesus Christ. And you reach out to that God, the God as love defined for divine intervention. That's the first defense against a powerful spell. You ask in the name of Jesus to break it. You need supernatural aid. Women in solidarity. But now that you know what you know, you would choose to become the prisoner. You would regret it for the majority of the time you were the woman prisoner at Birkenau. You would be starving, delusional, cold, tortured. You would want to wish for the end of your misery to come sooner than later. And then, most likely, the end will start with someone shouting at you to get up, and you would walk barefoot, your ribs protruding, your stomach protruding, and you would somehow manage to hold your friend's hand when it came time to cram together 1,000 bulimic girls in a ditch. You would make a joke to your friend that you finally accomplished your dream of losing weight, but this wasn't what you had expected. And she would smile, because laughing would take energy she did not have. You walk into this stark, dank room full of wooden planks where the women were packed like sardines with no heating, no food, no working toiletry. People packed together, marked to die. You do not walk the full circle inside this room. Halfway, you cut in the middle of the herd and walk out. On the way out, a strong thought moves you. 1,000 women in solidarity, fasting, like Jesus did in the wilderness, knowing they were on their way to heaven. Those who gave up hope with those who still clung on to it. In their final hour, during their last breath, they were asked the same question you were asked in 2013. God is love, true or false? Those who said true came home. Those who said false come back home later. You had chosen false. You stayed here so you can tell their story. They now know, and you now know, that the answer is true. And yet, there were 1,000 winners that day. For those who chose true and those who chose false. Jesus came back first, so we had the power of choice to say true or false. Then Jesus is coming back again, so that those who said false can retake the exam. You remember now, like Quicksilver, Marcia became a skeleton, but her soul soared because she chose true. You were more cynical. You bore hatred and resentment for what happened to you. You hated God for allowing this to happen. You chose false, as in God is love, false. And you stayed behind to witness again, to examine again, to test the algorithm again. You are here now, revisiting what happened to you. A reincarnated woman, now 5'1", plump, with food, fat, and muscles. But the two of you were liquidated. Your friend Marcia ascended to heaven and became part of the Holy Ghost's network. And she made a commitment to you that when you come back to visit what happened to you and her, she would guide you through this walk. She tells you that when she shed her flesh and became fully spirit, ascending from the Birkenau fields, she saw her body like one would see their clothes on the bathroom floor. She became naked, authentic, and free. Free to love and be in love. And as she was ascending, she also saw the demons possessing the men who had held the two of you captive. She tells you that the Nazis were the real prisoners because the demons still rode their backs like slave masters whipping their oxen. Then she saw you who negotiated with the angel assigned to you. This angel told you that you can retake the test. This time, the angel tells you you'll do better, perhaps even pass the test, for you got one more friend now who is on your side, who is on the other side, who has your back. This friend, Marcia, will guide you through your second walk here to visit again. In this second walk, you will pass the test because you have a friend to help you. Birkenau, Poland, February 1945. She tells you that the pain will pass. Just be patient. Wait. But you don't hear her because it took longer for you to let go. She held onto your hand, but you only felt her bones, and she hugged you, though you were still struggling with this test of faith. It was the absence of faith that blocked you from hearing her counsel. She was already on the other side, and she tells you to let go. She tells you that the pain will be short, like a prick, and describes the new breath of life that is flowing through her. She is in presence of pure love, and she is pure love. She tells you while you are still struggling with the test of faith, You were looking away from her and from God. You closed your eyes in shame. You closed your ears in blame, and you stayed away from the light. You did not trust it. You hated it. The angels came to comfort her, and her hands were once again soft and smooth, the touch of youth, of joy, of love. The angels came to comfort Marcia, who couldn't get through to you. They touched her hand, which turned back into soft and smooth, the touch of youth, of joy, of love renewed. Birkenau, Poland, February 2019. She opens her eyes when you walk into Birkenau. This time, you are a tourist. And from heaven she smiles, for she knew one day you would come back to investigate the truth of the true-false test. She whispers to you as you head back to the tour bus. Marcia smiles at you, but you don't see it, and instead you get a tingling sensation. Marcia is smiling, laughing in delight that this time you have chosen to play the role of a serious journal artist in disguise as an American tourist with the agenda of becoming a famous writer and an effective entrepreneur. But really, in this moment, you're a broke girl with $200 left in your checking account, waiting for your next retirement payment to come so you can continue acting the part of journal artist and entrepreneur you made up on your Facebook. Marcia is amused that you have quite the imagination this time around. Fast forward 60 years. You came as one of the 29 tourists today who chose to see it from the eyes of a perpetrator, yet would still choose to be a prisoner. The only difference this time, as Marcia shouts to the angels in delight as a stand for your ascension, is that you will have chosen true. True for you, true for your family, true for everyone whose lives you have moved, touched, and inspired. True, and reunite with her. She says this proudly to the angels, and the angels who are looking after you nod in agreement. The tour guides. You feel bad for the two tour guides, the man who did all the talking for 3 hours straight during the Auschwitz and Birkenau walks, and for the lady tour guide whose job was to sit next to the driver and tell all the passengers on the bus all the rules of the camp. Her job was to tell you when your breaks are, short as they were, and what the rules are. As a tourist, you are here in this death camp and gone tomorrow. But for the tour guides, they have to clock in and clock out, day in and day out, because this is their jobs. Get that for you, babe. Go ahead, honey.
that's just human nature, because because we're nuts. And I wouldn't say that we're sinful. I would just say that we're missing a connection. This is an ancient idea, right? It goes back. In fact, Freud denied it, but he was a fairly serious Jew. And the Jewish idea is called the Yetzer Hara, which means the evil impulse. There's another, he's called it Eros and Thanatos, right? The life impulse and the death impulse. But there's a thing called the Yetzer Hara, which in Jewish tradition is that evil side of our conscience. It wants to kill us. It wants to lead us astray. It wants to call lies truth and truth lies. It says, you can go out and cheat on your wife. Of course, we know it's against the law, but in this case, who would blame you? Or you can cheat on your taxes, or blah, blah, blah. Or it's not a good idea to call that son of a gun, your neighbor, an XYZ. That's not a good idea. But the way he looked at you today, right? So all day long, there's this other side of our nature called the Yetzer Hara, the dark side, or the Sitra Achra, right? We got to figure out how to deal with it. And one way we can deal with it is a religion. Another way we can deal with it is drama, right? The problem is using the mind to cure the mind, and it's really, really difficult. And the term that Freud used was psychoanalysis, which is psycho is the soul. Right? He's really talking about the soul. He's trying to find out what is the soul, right? So you're not going to find the soul through reason, because you can't point to it. So people say, the soul doesn't exist, I can't point to it, right? Well, you can't point to patriotism. You can't point to love. You can't point to justice. These are ideals, right? You can point to some examples, but you can't point to the thing. So we know that the soul exists. Right, so the question is, how do we examine our soul? How do we get closer to God? How do we get closer to the truth? And one way is through drama, is by being relieved of the burden of our consciousness. Why did the chicken cross the road? To get to the other side. What?
Let's go!